Thanks for watching this recording of the launch event for the Birmingham Community Development Practice Hub. It was recorded on the 3rd of September 2021 at 2 p.m. So in today's session, we're going to give you a brief overview of the Community Development Practice Hub. We'll hear from Carol Hebden and Joe Bagby from J&J Consulting, and they'll present findings from the scoping study they undertook for a community-wide community development hub of practice, which is what we're going to be launching today. We'll hear from Cormac Russell from Nurture Development, and he'll give us a talk around asset-based practice. And we'll also hear briefly from Steph Fiedel-Hall, who's a facilitator, and she'll be running some peer learning groups for community development professionals in the city. So onto the programme. So the Community Development Practice Hub aims to connect, inspire and upskill community development practitioners in Birmingham. Its mission is to advocate for a practice of community development in the city that focuses on doing with, not doing to. The hub has been developed by BVSC and is a legacy project of the 7-year Aging Better in Birmingham programme. Although the resources are designed for people working with people of any age or groups of any age. So it's not just for older adults. To say our definition of a community development practitioner is individuals or organisations who work with people in Birmingham so they can take collective action to make changes to the things that are important to them and their communities. So I'll touch briefly on why we've set this hub up. I say we'll hear shortly from Joe Bagby and Carol Hebden about the research that underpinned it, which is very Birmingham specific. But just to say, community development happens in communities across Birmingham right now, as we're speaking, with practitioners now predominantly located in third sector organisations, whereas before that might have been a much more mixed approach with people embedded within the public sector. And after a decade or over a decade now of public sector retrenchment and austerity, there's very little specialist infrastructure support or guidance that helps articulate or define what an intentional practice of community development looks like, and with limited opportunities for professional development and even networking. So our research also indicated that while practitioners often aspired to apply strengths-based approaches in their work, tensions existed between that aspiration and their practice, and how that intersects and interacts with commissioning processes, organisational cultures, and the wider interconnected systems that they work in, which are often rooted in deficit-based approaches. So BVSC has been working with community development professionals from Birmingham for the last 6 months to develop these resources. We've created a website that has information, guidance, tools, and stories from local people here in Birmingham. And it also has links to relevant research, reports, talks, workshops, and other resources from around the globe. And we hope to add to these resources over the next 6 months. We also created a Slack message board, which I can again post in the chat later, and this is a networking platform, and the idea is we want to connect people across the city together to network, to share information, and to offer peer guidance. We've also devised a 6-month pilot program of professional development activity to better understand what local people want, and it offers various ways to participate, including free and subsidised action learning sets, workshops, training, and peer-led talks from both frontline staff and managers working in the field in the city. And ultimately, the primary aim for the first 6 months is to bring people together. It's about you. So please join us on this journey. So that's it from me. Again, you can find out much more information about the hub on the website, and obviously you can search through the resources and tools and see the programme, the 6-month pilot programme of events and activities, and access the Slack platform.
Hi, thanks, Dave. So thank you for the introduction, and hello to everyone. I'm Joe Bagby, and if Carol speaks, you should see her.
Hello.
So we're going
to be here.
So together we're going to be talking to you through the piece of scoping work that we carried out about 20 months ago in that strange place called a pre-COVID world. So next slide, Dave, please. So this piece of research scope came out of the local evaluation for Ageing Better in Birmingham, the lottery funded programme. So Ageing Better in Birmingham has had an intentional being based around asset-based community development model for the last 7 years. And the local evaluation looked at how embedded this approach was and how the Ageing Better enablers understood and delivered their work within this model. The evaluation highlighted that the experience and practice across Ageing Better was variable, but that the connecting and forming community relationships had significant value in delivering the sustainable change the programme hoped for from the beginning. So this piece of scoping research aimed to better understand this and then to reflect on how effectively to resource an intentional community development approach here in Birmingham for the future. Next slide.
So I guess what we wanted to do when we began this scoping was to really be authentic in capturing what was going on through the Ageing Better over the last 7 years. So putting our heads together, it was that stuff of what was our research considerations, and that was really important for us, so that we could really sort of tease open how embedded the ABCD model was, etc. And so we wanted to look at what was that like to host a community development practice within organisations. What was the creativity? What were those skills and attributes to actually hold that space and journey with that? And was there something across Birmingham that could define what a community development practice was? And also around that sort of nuanced support and training. So for us, what we did was we looked at, approaching those involved in Ageing Better, those in the practice, leadership and management, taking those 3 lenses so that we could start to bring out what it was that was going on. So we used a desktop. So we went to what was available, public information, a whole host of things. And we also completed online surveys with practitioners so that they could express the voice about what that was like. The same with the leadership and management. And so by collecting all of that information, we were able to sort of look at what was the current themes that were going on so that we could help to, if you like, shape the intention of the community practice hub. So next slide, please. So what we found within this was that there was across Birmingham limited amount of community development training and resources. It was like we were finding that what was being told to us was that actually practitioners and organisations were sort of searching for what that actually looked like and what that actually meant for them, and very much about how they self-resource that as well. Next, thank you. And actually what we found was that there was the area around practitioners actually holding diverse relationships to inspire strengths within communities to be revealed. That actually in many cases that people, neighbourhoods didn't know what was in their hands and the strength. So actually that complexity about drawing out that in the first instance was something, and being able to recognise the value of what frontline practice were holding was very important about revealing the strengths in the first place. And the acknowledgement that actually that the ABCD was not necessarily a model, but an approach to activating strengths. So it wasn't seen as, this is how we work. It was more about how we can grow in an organic way. And I think, there was, some of the stuff was revealed that actually community development is an art and not a science. and then actually being immersed in it is the stuff that journeys and helps us to grow and be together. So there were some conundrums also about how community development outcomes could be applied, particularly maybe in service delivery organisations where targets were driven. What did that look like? So there was these underlying ebbs and flows of like, how do we measure? How do we put, if you like, these targets or outcomes into a community development which is based on growing relationships which reveal strengths. And then finally, one of the other things that came out was about how you know, the management and supervision of holding you know, a community development practice within an organisation looked. What we found was that by going to public information about job specifications, for example, what did, you know, sort of the attributes and the key skills were required in practitioners to actually, you know, to take on these roles. So you know, all of those things actually were conundrums and thinking and to think through. But many of the practitioners actually, you know, valued that stuff of coming together and peer learning and growing their knowledge together, which was really important in actually how we presented our findings overall. So thank you, Dave.
Go on to the next slide then, Dave. So what are our reflections? Well, for us, having looked through and sifted through, as Carol said, the desk-based stuff, the questionnaires, but also the one-to-one interviews that we conducted, you know, relationships are at the heart of community development practice. And relationships that are open, they are generous, they're enabling, and they're not solely based on bringing problems together and fixing them. But those kind of relationships take time to develop and are often activated by doing things together and slowly accumulating that confidence. As community development practitioners, people also need to develop a variety of relationships, both with local people, local businesses, charities, community activation, community activists and organisations, as well as infrastructure organisations and systems. So building those is not a linear process. There is no fixed way to grow those. So practitioners seek connections and actually need to be skilled to navigate quite complex spaces to get to those relationships. As Carol's already mentioned, in organisations, it can be difficult to report against a deliverable target when spending time navigating complexity. This can be more challenging if you're the only community development practitioner in an organisation, and especially one that is wired to count outputs and deliverables, rather than that sense of connecting and growing relationships that are developing in quite organic ways. In the asset-based approach, the most significant shift is away from that doing to people, that doing for people. And it's about practitioners doing with people to enable the recognition and releasing of people's skills, their gifts and their talents to grow their communities. And again, that takes time. So another element that came across quite clearly is that practitioners, those people who are out there doing this, actually require the right supervision and development to flourish in carrying out community development tasks. It's a different kind of work. And this kind of support needs to be easily accessible, whether you're a practitioner working on the ground or you're someone who's the next level up the chain, if you like, of providing line management and supervision. Actually, those people need to be resourced too. And recruitment. Recruitment really does need to be consistent in the way in which it resources the best skills for these community development roles. So job descriptions and person specifications need to be working together and not against each other to achieve this. We've already mentioned in the third box, you know, those tensions that can exist within organisations for the practitioner. And if those things aren't aligned from the start, if you've got the wrong person, the wrong skills, but to do the right task, or the other way round, then actually you're setting tension into the process already. So we need to make sure that we are supporting that whole process and aligning right. Next slide, please, Dave.
So in being authentic to what we found and to take, you know, what was asked of us to help present a recommendation for what the community development hub practice looked like, there were two sort of really deep reflections in this. And one was about valuing the community knowledge. And very often, as I said, you know, communities are busy knowing those spaces. So what, you know, the community development hub of practice was to create a space to hold this expertise, to grow that knowledge and experience and expertise as within those communities, so that the practice could be held and shared with others. And this was really important, that it is also not static, but it's fluid as well. So one of the ideas about creating a digital space for, you know, an opportunity for people to touch base into, to connect in with some learning. You know, our previous scoping found that there was very limited information around what that community development practice looks like. And, you know, bringing the voices from the grassroots into a space where others could connect into, to touch into and take on board that skills and expertise, meant that the community hub of practice could continue to grow that. And so that was one of the most important priorities, that it was a live a space where people could feel that they could be part of something and to grow it and to share the knowledge that was gained through across Birmingham.
Next slide, Dave. Yeah, lovely. So, you know, all that is held in this very much a relational framework. You know, being effective in community development practice is, of course, about having some really useful knowledge about how communities, organisations and systems should work, but also about how they are working in our city. But actually, when the chips are down and our backs are against the wall, in say maybe like a global pandemic or something, as the saying goes, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. So actually this hub of practice is underpinned and is all about all of that expertise, but at its heart, it's about growing and resourcing relationships. It's about resourcing the skills and the creativity. It's about igniting the passions and the talents of our communities and our community development practitioners and the organisations that host them. It's about all of that in the round. So as Carol said, we need to invest in the journey with people, to grow, to step out, and just beyond what they are and who they know, unlocking their potential, holding the stories of what happens when, and supporting the what if I tried this, nudging fellow practitioners back to the aspirations to see communities doing for themselves, and then developing the connections through people to systems that can be such a positive and yet at times a negative experience in individual and community lives. So, as Carol has said, this is nuanced and it's changing. It's the ever-moving challenge of the relationships we all need for our mutual flourishing of our city of Birmingham and in our city of many communities. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's helped you understand where this community development hub of practice has come out of from Birmingham people.
So thank you, Carol, thank you, Joe, that was really interesting. Just to say, people can drop questions into the chat and we can answer them at the end.
It's lovely to be with so many people, and thank you for showing up. It's a real privilege as well to be hosted by what I think is a circle of folks who get this stuff in their bones anyway. So I think what Joe and what Carol and what David have just said is that if we're going to get serious about citizens being in the driving seat, then we have to get serious about the practitioners who are going to be alongside them being appropriately supported and not being stifled or sandwiched by bureaucracy. I think that's broadly what I'm hearing. And that instinctively, the practitioners on the ground who are doing the doing don't really survive very long unless they're working with people. Because reality is such that I think most people won't tolerate patriarchy. You know, the problem is that often the people who are managing the practitioners are themselves so removed from the day-to-day realities that actually shape and form our practice that through no fault of their own, they're managing out of a fantasy rather than a reality. And that's always a dangerous thing to do. So the trick, I think, might be a bit like what Birdsong are doing, is get rid of a lot of the layers of management. Particularly management that is not actually on the ground understanding the process, and really think much more about hosting, about liberating, about animating, and about good pedagogy, about how do we do this work well. And you know, one of the things that shocks me over and over again is how we see such fabulous community practice and community development in spite of the fact that there's so little support, in spite of the fact that there's so little, for example, reflective practice. I don't know if you found this in your research, but it's really interesting to ask practitioners who day in, day out are trying to be alongside communities and have integrity and authenticity and deal with the politics of it, who are not themselves given space with colleagues who understand reality of community development to reflect on their practice. It's considered to be a luxury rather than a necessity. And often, quite sadly, they're managed by people who don't even know that it's an important thing to do. So management has become, I think, a real enemy of community development. And for no other reason than I think people who are managing a lot of the practitioners are themselves not necessarily freed up to be a support. They're being asked to do something that is itself not about being with the practitioner, but about doing to, maybe sometimes for. So it's almost like we're being audited rather than cheered on. And that might sound like a bit of a gripe, and I'm sorry if it does, but it's not intended in those terms. It's actually intended, I work across about 35 different countries, and it's intended as a report out from the field of what we're actually empirically seeing, which is such an own goal. So we know through pandemics, and I think through just paying attention, that communities, when they're connected, particularly in small places like neighborhoods, so when the neighborhood becomes a primary unit of change, like Hodge Hill, Firs, Bromford, you know, lots of different, you know, these neighborhoods, you work in them. And variously understood. I mean, you could call it a village, you could call it a town, you could call it, but small bounded places. When those places are enabled, in other words, from a connecting point of view, neighbors are supported to connect with other neighbors, find out what each other cares about, and then actually start doing stuff together, then power goes. And it's, again, maybe just these are remarks, so some will land well and some maybe will cause a little bit of a controversy, and I think that's good too. Let's talk that through. But it seems to me that if we think about the work of doing to, doing for, doing with, and I would argue fourth domain, and that's done by communities without necessarily any practitioner helping, right? That a big part of what we're trying to figure out here is, how do you get into a situation, a relationship? You know, First Nations would say, how do we get into a right relationship, right, with those that we serve? And I think one of the things that's very clear is that when there's a good host organization that's really like a small local community interest company or whatever it might be, but is really rooted and embedded, not in bureaucracy, but in a place, in a community, and in trusting relationships, most of the time they follow their nose and they know what to do if they're free to do it. And sometimes, particularly in response to a crisis, we're seeing it in our work in New York at the moment in response to the flooding of the subway. What you'll find is every so often, this great enlightenment, which takes all of 4 hours in a crisis, happens with foundations and funders. And they go, oh, well, let's just tell people we trust them and tell them to do whatever needs to be done. And good stuff happens. And people figure it out. And hey, presto, you know, people kind of do what they have to do. They call for support as they need it, and things work out. And once the crisis ends, we go back to this rather stifling kind of managerialist top-down approach. So it's really exciting to see that you guys are actually recognizing the core issue here is about how do practitioners organize for power, so that they have a collective, unified, and may I say even maybe unionized, dare I say it, voice that actually says, we know what we're doing as practitioners because we have lived and we have art-based experience, to use Carol's term. And we're quite happy to actually, you know, in a sense, share that knowledge. But this is about organizing for power. And I think there's a lot of kind of overlap between that experience as a practitioner trying to organize for power, to be heard, and for freedom, and what communities are doing day in, day out. And again, to go back to that idea of right relationship, I love the image of the 3-lane swimming pool, you know, where in the first lane, there are whole sets of things that communities can do themselves. And largely all that needs to happen is we need to get rid of the bureaucratic debris that actually kind of blows them off course or blocks them from progressing in the first place. So really understanding what are those things in that first lane, and how can we just really be curious about those things? So shifting out of a delivery modality and really into a discovery mindset, you know, and really going to communities with a huge dose of humility. Now, I think practitioners do that day in, day out. But I think the difficulty is so often we are being asked to stay in delivery mode rather than doing what we know works, which is to start in discovery mode and show respect for the capacities and the strengths and the nous that communities have. So that's the first lane. And I think we need to do a lot more collectively to organize as a community of practitioners to say, folks, enough is enough. You know, you are not going to manage or control your way top down into a preferred future. You're going to do it by respecting the people you serve, not by putting them down in order to get the funding to lift them back up again, which is the model we have at the moment, but by starting with a real recognition that in all kinds of ways, from health to well-being to safety, communities are doing things collectively to create those outcomes. They're just invisible. And a big part of community development work in that first lane is making the invisible visible. But we have to be free to do it. It takes time. And it also takes skill. You know, I've heard over and over again, managers make this kind of quip, oh, all community development practitioners do is sit on their hands. And when they do use their hands, it's to lift up a cup of tea or eat a biscuit. Have you ever heard that? It's outrageous, and it's worthy of a little bit of a grin, but it's actually really cynical, and it's also quite ignorant because it fails to understand the skill, the craft, and the art form that's required to do this work well. Judging something you don't understand is not necessarily a worthy contribution given what we need to do going forward. So that's the first lane. What is it communities can do alone, right? Not with, not for, not to, but by themselves. The second lane is, what is it on top of the stuff they can do in the first lane? What is it communities could do with a little bit of outside help? Well thought of, light touch stuff, grassroots funding, cheering on, stuff that isn't about treating the community like they don't know and therefore they need capacity building. You know, they're not organized adequately, so let's organize them by training them how to themselves into looking like the institution that can be less frightened of them. But actually saying you're perfectly formed, actually. All we really need to do is to understand what's different about the way you organize a social movement and the way institutions organize, and making sure that the institution can actually be a supplementary support to community rather than domineering. And this is a really big issue. I think one of the big challenges, and I don't know that words like co-production quite communicate this, but I think it's endeavored, to do so. But the power issue has to be really upfront here. And I think what we're trying to do in that second lane is make sure that the institutional world is in service. It's in the backseat of communities, not in the driving seat. And, whenever an institution defines the issue, the community will end up in the back seat or on the side of the road, but they are not in the driving seat. When police come in and say, the issue around here is crime and public safety, well, I think what we'll end up with is an argument about more police. Whereas I think when we talk about what it means to be well and to be strong and to be powerful and to be connected and to feel safe around here, we'll end up with communities in the driving seat. If you start with sickness as the focus, you'll end up with doctors in the lead. If you start with well-being as the focus, you'll end up with community in the lead. So being thoughtful about power here is a really critical issue. And that's why I really believe that community development workers get it in the neck time and time again, because not everybody in the institutional world wants to relocate authority or power. Happy to relocate responsibility, as we've seen of late, where every so often when we want businesses to thrive again, we'll blame the community for not being responsible in the face of a pandemic. So we'll happily gaslight communities and practitioners. That's relocating responsibility. But relocating power and money, now hang on, that's just a step too far. But actually, it's the only way real change can happen. And in a sense, there's a word for that. It's a dirty word, and it's called democracy. So in the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about community development, we're talking about democracy and democratizing and making sure that in a democracy, the role of citizens is at the center and the role of practitioners and professionals is supportive. The third lane, I think, in the swimming pool is there are a range of things communities need done for them. That's the truth. But we have no way of knowing what those things are until we do the community development first. Because it's in that community development process that communities begin to discover what it is they can do themselves and with some help. And it's from that perspective they can then authoritatively say, and here's what you as a useful outsider can do for us. That's how democracy works. And my sense is, I think we're stuck in the third lane. I think an awful lot of our institutions are busy asking, what can we do for you? I don't think they're bad people. I think they're good people, but they're stuck in that kind of possessive service mindset that says we've got a cluster of people out there with a bundle of needs. And what we've got to do is we've got to basically create a pipeline to them. And community development staff are the relationship people that get them to engage with our programs. And nothing could be further from the truth. So I thought it would be fun to take some time now to actually have a conversation about that. And I guess my question to you is, what strikes you about what you've heard David, Joe, Carl, and just there myself say? And have you any thoughts about this? So if it's okay with you, David, if we could open the floor, both through chat, obviously, as well. There's quite a lot of chat there. But also, it's always nice to hear people into expression. I always feel less lonely when I hear voices, particularly when they're not in my head. So let's hear from a few people.
Quite a few questions, actually. So the first one's from Tahira, and I hope I pronounced that rightly. She's a community connector from Family Action in Birmingham. And she said, hi, I would like to ask how we can monitor and report voices of the community. I know it's about who we know, our connections, but how do we report those findings as real evidence? So for example, in an impact report or monitoring or scoping review.
Great. Carol or Joe, do you want to take that first, and then I'll...
Well, yeah, so that's a very interesting point, but I think it's also important that we perhaps identify the difference between, you know, impact, outcomes, outputs, and all of those things, and, you know, capturing voices and how we do that. And in some of the work that I'm involved in, that could be in a whole host of and a whole range of spaces as well. And very often it's how do we capture the narrative? How do we capture that stuff? And how do we invite that as well? So what are those, which are the ways in which we can enable people to present their story and their narrative about the impact and being alongside. So I guess I would invite a curiosity about how that was done, rather than looking at in a box form, and being curious about where those spaces are, rather than just being formulaic and systematic. And yeah, being curious and have conversations with people is important. And I'm sure there are many people on this platform here who will probably be able to support you in that. But I would invite certainly curiosity around how to tell those stories well.
Joe, thanks for that, Carol. That's great. Joe, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really important when we think about people's voices that the closest we can get to people being their own voice, always the best. And so it is finding ways where authentic voices can be heard, because often we put our own spin and our own layer of understanding when we retell a story, and it can have an impact, but actually that strongest impact is when it is told in the authentic voice. So I challenge you to find those ways to bring those voices into the spaces where they need to be heard.
That's powerful. One of the things that strikes me as well is that typically when we're in conversation with people, their power is in the conversation, but it's never clear. It's like it's backstaged. And I think it's really important to bring that on stage and say, could we just talk about power here? So for example, if somebody says, I really want to have a very meaningful, authentic conversation with you so I can monitor you, I say, oh, that's really interesting. So on stage, your intent is to monitor me. Well, sorry, that's not an equitable conversation right there. So I'm coming from a place where you don't trust me. And I think real conversations go at the speed of trust. So from the get-go, I think we have to contract as citizens and as practitioners, and indeed as, you know, commissioners and whatever, we have to contract for power. And we've got to find ways of relocating it. So some of that is about being really thoughtful about language. Are we using evaluation to monitor people because we're suspicious of them? And then we use kind of silly excuses like, well, it's public money, we have to protect it, as if somehow we're more sanctimonious and, you know, more privileged than the citizens that are using it. And I think we need to push back against that and say, let's move past monitoring and let's actually start moving into serious learning. The other thing is, I mean, you take data is really important. You've got to ask the question, who owns the learning at the end of this? Facebook, for example, is harvesting our data all over the place. I mean, Facebook is like a crime scene that just nobody has put the, you know, the red ribbon around it yet. We have to start really recognizing that our data and our information as citizens is valuable. And it's not just there to be given to the first bidder. We've really got to find a way, I think, as citizens and as practitioners of saying, how do we learn with communities in a way that ensures they own the learning, not us? So that this isn't being done to keep a funder happy, but this is being done to create a different and a better social order. We've got to get a higher value set than just keeping the funder happy, because I don't think that's good enough anymore. Never was good enough, but I think we need some pushback. And years past in the 70s, I remember community development, you know, workers used to do this. We used to be radical, you know, we used to push back. And I think we need to push back a little bit. I really do.
I think just wanting to add to that, Cormac, if I can, is that step of being immersed with people and being alongside people and not making judgments and journeying with people is really important, because that really helps to hear those stories and walk alongside. You can't, you know, monitor and evaluate if you're at a distance. You have to be immersed in that. You have to be with people.
Yeah.
We also have another question. We've got quite a few questions to get through, another 3 at the moment. So we got a question from Basharat. He's from Our Community Foundation. And the question is, how do we get local authorities or councils to understand this way of thinking? So we can organize locally, but need external support from local authorities, institutions and partners, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I defer to my colleagues. Do either of you want to come in?
Again, I think it's journeying. I think it's journeying with people. I think it's about owning what you know and being, you know, and in a sense, helping others to see the journey and the impact that you're making. You know, we have experience of doing that, about journeying with those who commission us, so they help them to navigate their systems. So yeah, it's about journeying with people. Again, it's the same essence, about helping people to see and understand the work that you do.
Thanks.
And I think there is also a need to have good advocates that can kind of approach the people in the systems in the local authority. And I think that probably is another element of the work of this community development hub of practice. There needs to be that sense that there is an ongoing connection and dialogue at those levels as well, because otherwise the right commissioning opportunities, those things that kind of bring kind of some of the financial resources into communities will never shift. They will always be driven by other factors. So I do think that there is actual work to be done, you know, in kind of trying to bring people who have those kind of responsibilities to shift their thinking, to engage with us as communities in different ways.
I would just add, I suppose, a couple of thoughts. One is, most local authorities in the UK, I think this is true in Europe, but particularly in the UK and Ireland, organize themselves very much around their institutional focus and their institutional imperatives and their silos. And if they're not doing that, they're organizing themselves around what they see as individual needs. So they'll place a huge virtue on person-centered ways of working. The NHS do the exact same thing. So that's why, you know, you end up with a lot of projects that are being called community development, which are much more about referral than really solid community development. And I think, you know, a group like yours might want to think about what might be a better unit of change rather than the institution, you know, kind of staring at its own navel and trying to suck salvation from its own thumb, which is a lot of what local government reform has been about, or, you know, trying to do this lifestyle change stuff, which has been so much a feature of the nudge theory and of behavioral economics and of a lot of public health in the UK. So how do we move past the institution and past the individual, which have never really been the heartland of community development? That's the medical model, actually. And the medical model has really guided the NHS and local government. And of course, as public health has been pulled into local government in the UK, the more progressive public health stuff has really been undermined over the last course of years. The same has happened in the US. So I believe one of the ways that we could practically really open up new space is to say, what about the neighborhood being considered to be a primary unit of change? And really thinking about supporting power to grow at the neighborhood level. And I don't mean the electoral ward level, I mean the neighborhood level. And beginning to say, like, what would happen if instead of having, you know, a neighborhood watch, or instead of having a residents association, we actually had a well-organized association of associations in every neighborhood in Birmingham that actually respected diversity, that actually included the stranger, that actually built, you know, celebration around all that is strong within our neighborhoods. And if they were able to be organized in such a way that they could define what the 3-lane swimming pool needs to look like, I think then they would tell local government how it needs to organize itself to be supportive. But as long as that isn't happening, what I think we'll end up with is a lot more, let's develop the town center and let's, you know, do in our next master plan what we believe the community needs. And that's not, I don't think, really good community development. So we're in an awkward space because I think we're minding the gap between a preferred future and a current reality. And we can kind of imagine our way into that, but I don't think it's just about imagining. I think it's about organizing, actually. And it's about enabling people at neighborhood level to recognize they're not passive consumers of whatever service is on offer, but they're actually powerful citizens. And if they get organized, they can be more powerful. So there's something about organizing around those strengths at neighborhood level, and then supporting the neighborhoods to organize with each other across the city, that I think is a really powerful way forward. So, some thoughts.
Thank you. We got a question and comment from Jen. So she says, the presenters have rightly noted that there is a lack of space for reflective practice with other practitioners who understand community development. This is a familiar problem over the last 30 years or more. There have been times when networks and spaces have been created to enable this type of reflection, but sadly, funding pressures have meant that these spaces have closed. Given the importance of shared reflective spaces to support practice learning by community development practitioners, what can be done to create sustainable spaces that don't disappear with funding changes?
Great question, eh? Carol and Joe, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I haven't got a simple answer to that, except that actually we learn by doing together. And I think that actually this is where, it isn't, reflective practice is not necessarily very visible for a lot of people, and there aren't people who have the expertise within small organisations. So it's definitely something that is a feature of some of the work of this community development hub of practice. These are the skills and the practices that we want to build in. And yeah, as far as funding goes, there's never going to be a bottomless pit of that. But the more that we invest in these kind of practices that we share with each other, that we offer to work alongside each other, be accountable to each other, then we will start to grow those skills organically out into Birmingham.
That's great. Steph, your hand is up.
My hand is up. David might want to say a few more words as well, but one of the reasons I'm here and delighted to be here with Cormac and Joe and Carol is that I am running some groups for people to do that reflective practice, and we'll be working in ways which are very much in line with asset-based community development. I've just completed my first part of training with Cormac, and found it absolutely amazing. But those two groups are going to be there. They're funded as part of this project, and part of the reason I'm here today is to say, come along, make these groups what you want them to be. But I picked up a couple of phrases that have come up while you've all been talking, and one of them is about being alongside people. The skills that I bring to facilitating these groups and holding the space while you make it what you want it to be are specifically the skills of being alongside people. So we will not only be getting alongside one another, but you will then be taking those skills away so that you can set up that type of group for yourself. So hopefully this is a really sustainable way of working, and I'll just, anybody who wants to know more about what those groups are like, or David, if there's something specific you'd like me to say, but this is a real opportunity to come together, to support one another, and to have that space where we think in an asset-based community development way about, okay, so what can we do about this issue of not having a sustainable reflective practice space? We've got two groups.
So this one is from Tina Brogan, and she says, I'm reminded of a novel in which a poor character advised people to go to their poor neighbor when they are in need, and not to a rich person. Are there things that can be done which are not expensive, or is it inevitable that we need to go to the people with money to help the people without money?
It's a great question. Yeah, and I think to an extent the person who's asked the question has framed it in such a wise way. I suspect that they have a thought on the answer to that. But we don't have time to do what a good facilitator should do now, which is to ask the person who asked the question what they think. So do Joe or Carol, or does anybody else, including the questioner themselves, want to say anything in response to that?
I don't think so necessarily, other than the fact that I think there is something in that. But to going back to the earlier point, is that stuff around generosity, and as practitioners and people in the space of community, that generosity of sharing and growing that with others, I think is very important, so that we can be that person that, you know, that people can pick up the phone and create a relationship with, without having to go through the layers of who to connect to. And you know, I would like to invite a generosity of spirit between us all, that we can grow and be alongside each other, I think.
Yeah, it's the stone soup story, isn't it? You know, it's kind of looking at what we have first to secure what we need. Money should be the bait, not the fish. And the minute it becomes the fish, it becomes the point. And that's where dependency kicks in and power imbalance kicks in. So I think the questioner probably has some wisdom to share with us, and we should definitely bring that into the community of practice. We have one last question.
Yes, it was from Basharat, who says he agrees with the bottom-up approach, but how do we relocate power and money? Devolution is key, but it needs to be part of systems and processes.
Yeah. So just briefly, because I know you're trying to manage time, if I may just jump in and say that it's not easy. I mean, this is contested space, and it's really important that we are thoughtful about what we looks like, and we think about, you know, where our work ends and where the work of the wider community that we serve begins. So it's really important, I think, to think about how we're creating the conditions within which the people that we're trying to support can themselves take on those issues. I think that's just an important kind of subtle point to make, and it's obvious, but it does feel to me like a big part of what we're trying to talk about here is not just devolution, but subsidiarity, is that kind of principle that no bigger institution is going to do in Birmingham what a smaller, more localized institution is going to do. And I don't think currently there's a legislative framework to insist on that happening. And I think we kind of have a sneering kind of attitude in relation to subsidiarity. So I think part of an ask from a legislative and a structural perspective is that we actually get subsidiarity as a principle enshrined in how we do business, so that, you know, we're not abusing the core principle of community development, which is you should never solve problems that don't belong to you, right? So I think that's a critical thing. Over the years, I have seen amazing community development work, which has taken sometimes as much as a generation to actually precipitate, be destroyed in a matter of days by really poor institutional top-down approaches. So there is something about making sure that we figure out how to do something about that and that power issue. And perhaps that's something that in your future community of practice and your own reflective practice, you can begin to think about, you know, how do people who have very little status and very little money power create power to influence that kind of change? And how do we support the communities to do the same thing? I think that's kind of a core question at the heart of community development.
But to thank our speaker, Cormac, and Joe and Carol for taking time to come today, and all of you as well for taking time out of your Friday afternoon to come and listen to it. The resources are now available online, and our program will start, well, in September really, and now. And the link is bvsc.org/community development. So we hope to see you all in some way, shape or form over the next 6 months and maybe start to build those relationships.